Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Senior Center to hear me go on and on and on about Holliston. Now, I could go on and on and on about Holliston, but really, I'm sort of more interested in hearing from you and not just me. I don't want to drone on like a talking head, but I will give you just a little bit of a nutshell introduction to the history of Holliston, just in case either a few of you have forgotten about it, or maybe you didn't even know it. But Chris, luckily, he gave me a little bit of a thought about doing this, about Holliston. We are coming up in 2 years to the 300th anniversary. We'll talk about that at the very end. But what about Holliston? Where did the name come from? Why is there Holliston? How did that happen? Well, the nutshell story is that it used to be part mostly of Sherburne, and the people here in this end of Sherburne at the time found it too difficult on the Sunday mornings to make their way all the way to the meeting house, which was located in Sherburne. That's that meeting house that's on Route 16. So they hemmed and they hawed, but what they did was they went to the Great and General Court of Massachusetts, the legislature, and they said, look, can you make us just a precinct of Sherburne, and we'll be like West Sherburne, so that we can build sort of a satellite meeting house in the other end of town, and that'll make it easier for us to go to church. Well, of course, as it always happens, the legislature hemmed and hawed, and they pushed the story off, and they pushed it, and they just kept delaying dealing with that particular issue. Until one day, in runs a principal from Harvard College, and he said, guess what, guys? Guess what? We're getting 1,500 pounds per annum from this guy named Thomas Hollis, a merchant of London, and he's giving it as a donation every year to Harvard College to start a divinity school. Isn't that wonderful? And the reason why Thomas Hollis did it was he was going through his uncle's papers and saw that his uncle had done it, because his uncle had left notes saying that he was impressed with Harvard College because they admitted Native Americans along with all of the students. So everybody said, oh, hey, that's wonderful. You know what? We got this pesky little thing about Sherburne and these people in Sherburne. Tell you what we're going to do. We're going to tell them, instead of just doing a West Sherburne sort of a thing, we're going to make you a separate town. Isn't that great, guys? And guess what? We're going to name it Holliston. You're all set. So they send a letter out to a man named John Goulding, who was a principal amongst the town fathers of Sherburne at the time. He gets it landed in his lap. He lived someplace right around here, because this is Goulding Street. He was down this end of town. And he gets this letter going, oh my God, now we have to form a town government. We have to get a school going. We have to get a church built and all this. Oh my God. So you look at the original records of Holliston in 1724, December 3rd, 1724. So this weekend is going to be the 298. And he looks at the whole list and he says, you know what? We have all of these town offices that we have to fill. And so when you look at the original, you've got this one guy that's got 2 or 3 jobs, and another one that's got 3 or 4. You know, like you're a constable and you're going to be a selectman. Okay, you're going to be like overseer of the poor. You know, they just passed out as many as they could, because there were only a certain short number of men, of course, that they could call upon in order to do this. And the house that you see on the town seal was where they met to find out that this is what they were going to have to do. It was not because they all got together and said, let's have a town and we're going to name it Holliston. They didn't even know who he was. So Thomas Danforth, who was a minister and lived in Boston, and he also has a bit to do with the town of founding of Framingham. Anyway, he knew Thomas Hollis. He sent a letter off to Mr. Hollis, and he says, hey, guess what? They've named a town after you. Where? He was just as gobsmacked as the rest of them. And so he said, well, I guess I should do something nice. And so he sent, hopefully for the new church, which still hadn't been built quite yet. It took several years to do that. He sent off a Bible. He thought that was pretty appropriate for the time. There's your nutshell about Holliston. So here we are. You know, the descendants, I suppose, historically, of Thomas Hollis of London, who never came here. So we are on our own. So anyway, so what about Holliston? I have here on the table a few objects. 1, 2, 3, 4. I could have gone on, but I picked out 4 objects that were significant with the history of Holliston. And they may conjure up some memories even for some of you. Anyway, I like this one. First of all, this is probably just about the oldest, but cranberries. What the cranberries had to do with Holliston? We had a lot of bogs. George Batchelder in the 1850s decided he was going to do something about cultivating cranberries. He tried a few other things, including peanuts, that didn't work out. So he got cranberries because there were bogs all over Holliston just waiting to be cultivated and brought together. And that he did in a series of bogs that you can catch a glimpse of that land if you're up at the top of the 8-arch bridge looking a bit off to the right. But there were cranberries all over Holliston. You would find, I have found them walking, for instance, in the Brentwood Conservation Land. I'm walking along a little path and I look down and says, holy, look at that, a bunch of cranberries just lying there on the ground. My gosh, this is incredible. And you find them in Winnakeene Woods. You find them in all sorts of places. But George Batchelder, his other 3 brothers, who were not townies, they came from New Hampshire, all 4 of the boys. 3 of the boys built shoes and boots, but not George, the youngest. You know, you always have one of those in the group. And he decided, the heck with the shoes and the boots, I'm going to cultivate cranberries. And he did. He took all native cranberries that you can still find around. Goodbye, little cranberry. You know, and see how it bounces? That's very important with a cranberry, because if they bounce, they're good. There was an invention by Lauren Leland of Holliston who called it a cranberry separator machine, and it all had to do with the bounce of the cranberries in order to know which ones were good and which were bad. But there were several cranberries that were native to Holliston, which he did cultivate. One of them is the Holliston berry. Another is the Batchelder berry, named after George. Another, my favorite out of all of them, was the Centennial berry, which was down in that bog behind Woodland Street. It's kind of nestled in between the old, you know, right now the rail trail and also St. Mary's Cemetery. You can see it from all those points. But the Centennial berry, which he propagated and cultivated around 1875, and he named it in honor of course, the American Centennial. And that berry was very large. It could not be harvested by using the typical scoops that you see in all the historical renditions about cranberries. You had to pick them by hand. Well, that one killed it as a good cultivator, but that wasn't going to really help out. But we used to have groups of children and women in the fall that would go down to the cranberry bogs to help to pick as many as they could. But there was Holliston berry, the Batchelder berry, the Middlesex berry, and the Centennial berry. Can you find vestiges around? Yes, you can. In the conservation land that is behind the elementary schools, behind Placentino, deep there in the woods along the edge of Mill Pond, and there's a lovely walkway that goes through it. Right in that spot are some of the old native berries, and that's probably where George may have found some of them and brought them into those the large cranberry area. Holliston had at one time the northernmost cultivated cranberries in Massachusetts. Did not last long. Pretty much the cranberry bogs had been exhausted by about 1920. So unfortunately we don't look like the Cape. Well, we almost did in little bits and pieces. But Hopping Brook was another area where you can see the vestiges of the old cranberry bogs right along Hopping Brook. So there you go there. All right, that's one object. Another one is a baseball. And what would you think that Holliston has to do with baseball? Well, let it be told that back in the 1850s, Holliston was a powerhouse of Massachusetts baseball, which is really a little bit surprising because of the fact that here we are, way out here in the hinterlands. We were one of the first teams to form with several others in the area. Upton, Medway, Sharon, those were some of the big powerhouse teams. Non-professional, although there was money floating around in regard to baseball games. And I'm not even talking about gambling, but anyway, this is a lemon peel baseball. This is the type of ball that they would use back then. They did not play by the rules that we know, the New York style game that we see now, because there was another competing type of baseball. It was called the Massachusetts game and also the New England game of baseball. It had 4 bases. It had no strikes, really. You could tell the pitcher where you want that ball to come across the plate. There were no foul lines. The world was your baseball field. And there were 2 ways to get a person out. One was to throw the ball and hit the player, called soaking. The other way was the high fly. There were a couple of little vestiges of Massachusetts game that you do see in today's baseball. So next time you watch a game, when you see an overhand pitch, they were overhand pitching in Massachusetts game. New York at the time was all underhand. And also the high fly, that's another one. And other than that, the game died out because there were no foul lines. Holliston's team was very good at hitting the ball back. In other words, the ball would come in and you would hit it back because the world is your baseball field. They were the foremost team at the time in the late 1850s. And they were also a contender for what was called the Silver Ball Tournament in 1866. And that would settle who was the best baseball team in Massachusetts. We lost. Sorry about that. But we had a team at that time in the 1860s after the Civil War. Actually, it's even through the Civil War because the guys were still playing even when others were off fighting in battle. The Granite baseball team. There was the Bay State baseball team. And the very famous Winthrop baseball team, which everybody, when doing a little bit of baseball research, some people get confused. Well, Winthrop Baseball Club must have been in Winthrop. No, it was out here because it was named after Lake Winthrop. Oh. So, yeah, so it's a little bit confusing with some, but we set them straight. And the Winthrop team was the one in the 1850s. The ultimate baseball game was played. It was in 1860 in Worcester at the fairgrounds for a purse of $1,000. Now you think in 1860 $1,000 is quite a bit of money. All right, there were 2 teams. The people who were organizing this great tournament first went to New York and asked if a team would come up and play the best team in Massachusetts. But they would have to play like one game by New York rules and the other one by Massachusetts rules. They refused. So we had to look locally. And the team from Upton played a team, it was called the Union Baseball Club of Medway. But when you look at the roster, half of those players were from Holliston. Talk about putting in ringers. So it was a combination of both. So, in order to win the game, though, you had to get 100 runs, or as they called them, tallies, 100 of them. So they played for 6 days. They played for 6 days every day, and they only got to 50 to 47, and they just didn't feel that this was right. So they said, this is early October of 1860, they said, all right, tell you what, wait until next year. We'll meet up next May or June sometime. We'll play the rest of the game. Well, what happened in May and June of 1861? Civil War. And most of the players on both of the teams went off and enlisted. Many of them died. Many didn't come back. Although some of them did manage to survive and come back, and they formed parts of teams in Holliston right through the 19th century. Now, if you look at the old newspapers of Holliston in that time, Baseball was one of the premier subjects that you would see about local history in town. They were always, always talking about the baseball games and who they were. The Holliston team in the 1850s, they were all, shall we say, somewhat politely, they were all white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. After the Civil War, they found out something. What do you think it was when they came back from Civil War and started to form teams again? What do you think? They found out that these Irish kids knew how to play baseball really well. And they slowly decided that, well, maybe we'll try one or two of them. But some of the Irish kids in Holliston, down in Mudville, were forming their own teams, like the OK Club, the Emmett Club, and the Holliston Irish Athletic Club. And guess what? They were doing better than those other guys. So by the 1880s, the teams started to be integrated. And you would see that they finally gave in with that ostentatious idea that they were going to keep, just the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant ones. But no, the Irish kids were playing really well. So baseball continued, of course, to be the premier sport in Holliston. Still pretty much is in many people's minds. But I will tell you that basketball took over in the 20th century. And there was one story that Holliston had the best high school basketball team in the state. I don't know who was making that, that determination, but maybe it was. How's your hand?
Oh, go ahead.
All right?
It's my eye.
Hey, we almost got you, Chris.
That's a basic.
Yeah, you almost got him out, yeah.
That was a Minnesota, right?
Yeah, right, yes, that'd be a soaker, yeah.
Is this a remake of an old ball?
That is a replica, yeah, and it is made according to the specifications. Yes, they were softer.
It is soft.
Yes, it is softer, although there was one great story by one of the premier Boston players in a book called Boston Boys and the Games They Played, about a game on the Common in Boston where they were playing Holliston, which the first official game of the Massachusetts game of baseball was played in 1858 on the Common there, and it was Holliston against the Olympics of Boston. And the Boston player was chasing down a Holliston player, trying to hit him with the ball. And he's going back and forth, all of them, because you can run everywhere, And so he was chasing him down, and the Holliston player tripped and fell. And this guy Lovett walked up to him, stood right over him, and drilled him with the ball. And his comment was, oh, that was okay, that was acceptable, that was the way the game was played. Yeah, so sports was very big. We had no TV, we had no radio, we had no nothing. People were down at Goodwill Park right through the 20th century. That's where people used to go and congregate, and it was the biggest news in town, was what the baseball score was on the local town teams. And today's Mudville Baseball Club is trying to gain back just a little flavor of that. So keep that in mind. So that's the baseball. Now, one other thing that we have here, and this is always the one that kind of either gobsmacks everybody, but wax paper cutter box? Yes, a lot of people do know about this. And the wax paper cutter box was invented in Holliston. Go figure. Can you imagine? Yeah, unbelievable. I mean, who would have thought that a common household item actually got its birthplace here? But Mr. Arthur Moore, and I'll pass this around, Mr. Arthur Moore, he filed it on March 3rd, 1939, cut a box for wax paper, but he had to wait a little while in order to get that patent. December 24th, 1940, Christmas present. And it is patent number 2,226,477, if you care to look it up. So the Shawmut Wax Paper Company in Holliston, building is still there, right on where Railroad and Woodland come together. The building is still there, is the birthplace of the wax paper cutter box. I think that there are towns that have less fame than that. I mean, maybe we should have a sign coming into Holliston, welcome to the birthplace of the wax paper cutter box. Yeah, why not? Now, the other thing is I'm also going to pass around with it is that this was not the only wax paper invention that got a little bit of exposure here in Holliston. George Lovett in 1933, he did an improvement for wax paper in the process of making the same. And, it's tiny little figures on that. You go, well, okay, I guess it sort of makes it either more ripply or less ripply. I'm not sure. You can read a little bit on it. I'm going to pass these around just so that you can kind of see what we're talking about, okay? So, did everybody know about the wax paper cutter box? So, good, all right, I didn't want everybody to know about the wax paper cutter box. So, next time you cut a little bit. Just give poor Mr. Moore, who waited so long for that patent to come through. But think about that too when you go by that large gray factory building right there by Railroad Street. That's where it came from. And somebody had asked me otherwise at some other time, said, well, what do they do before that? You'd have to get a pair of scissors out and just cut off what you want. Now, wax paper at the Shawmut Wax Paper Company, they were making mostly the bread wrappers like you see on Pepperidge Farm. That's what their big part of their business was. And the Historical Society, we do have one of their scrapbooks with all the different wax papers and the wrappers and everything that were part of their history, which the wax paper cutter box is part of ours as well. So, now the last but not least, of course, lest we forget, a railroad spike, yeah. Luckily, I found one before they all went, the way of, metal and whatnot. But yeah, this is one of the older types. Came off of a spur, tracks that went from Framingham down to Milford, about 12 miles. And they got as far as Central Street by 1848. And of course they had other workers that were working on coming from the Milford end. And of course it took a little bit of a while to cut through the tunnel, the Phipps Tunnel under Highland Street. If you haven't ever just walked along the rail trail now, please do. It's one of the great scenic spots in Holliston. Now the thing is that a little bit was reported in the Boston newspapers about the spur track from Framingham down to Milford, and it stopped at Milford and go back and forth, back and forth. A little bit of passenger service, but the thing was that it was mostly for the industries that were along the way. It had first been proposed that they would put the spur track out of Ashland and follow almost the same line that Chicken Brook does. But people in Hall said, no, that's ridiculous. That's not going to hit any of the major industries. We want it to come right straight down. So they did. They put it down this way. Now, the thing is, when it was done, you would think that perhaps they would speak so highly of the 8-arch bridge, after all, we do. But no, that's not the thing that caught their eye and impressed them the most about it. It was not the Phipps Tunnel. It was something else about it that they really liked. And it is between Blair Square and the tunnel. And what impressed them was that they actually brought the grade up so that it was almost perfectly level all the way from Framingham to Milford. Now, apparently you can't go more than 13 degrees on an angle in a mile. It has to be less than that, especially for the old trains to come through. But walking along that stretch from Blair Square to the tunnel, you would take a look at both sides and realize this was all done with pickaxe and shovels, and I guess there was some steam engines that that these train companies had that could do a lot of the work, but it was mostly work that was just done by hand. And of course, along the way, things would get slowed down by these challenges of the terrain. And one of the slowdowns also can be blamed or thanked for a lot of these Irish immigrant workers that were hung up at certain spots along the way, and therefore, thus was born the vestiges of Mudville. Newcomers from Ireland. And they would settle in, and once that project got done, which it didn't take all that many years to do, now they got to find something else to do, well, they'd kind of settled in around town, and they were the main workers for the shoe shops in Holliston. And so they gathered in there. A few local builders saw a great opportunity to slap up a bunch of little old houses into this little conglomerate of a neighborhood, and presto, we have Mudville. Same thing happened down in Milford, that there was a certain area which did grow out of the trains that were coming in and out of Milford. And I would imagine Framingham was already well on their way to doing that. And so the spike really does have a lot to do with what brought to Holliston the population, and how the town grew, and it did help the shoe shops too, not only for shipping out everything, along with the straw hats, by the way. That was the second industry in Holliston was straw hats, until imports killed that one. But and the shoes and the boots were premier in Holliston, starting when the Batchelder brothers came down from Hampton, New Hampshire, settled into Holliston. 3 of them started making boots and shoes on a small basis. And that would have been like before 1850, but the trains came in, and that really caused an opportunity to increase their business. And boots and shoes from Holliston have been found all over the United States. Now, if truth be told, before the Civil War, what a lot of the boots and shoes that were being built in Holliston were cheap industrial shoes for the agrarian trade. And quite frankly, a lot of those shoes ended up being utilized and sold to plantations that had slaves on them down south. It was for the South and West population. We weren't making fine Italian leather shoes or anything like that. So that's one of those little blind spots in our history. But during the Civil War, we got a lot of contracts. We actually have had shoes found in shipwrecks, and some of them have lasted that long, that had the John Batchelder stamp on it. John Batchelder was also the one who started cottage industry. He did not have a big factory. His house on Norfolk Street, it's the large hip roof colonial on the left as you're just coming up the hill and around the curve. And he had in the back of his house several sheds. He would farm out the work. You make the heels, you do the soles, you do the uppers. All right, you're going to do all the uppers, and you're going to give them to the guy with the soles, who's then going to pass them over to the one with the other part that needs to go on it. And everybody would have a certain part of that shoe. And so that was sort of a cottage industry. His brother William did have a factory, so did Benjamin, but that's how they did it. They did the same way with straw hats. Us women folk, what would we do? We would get the rushes and all the different items, the straw that would be used to make the hats, but we would have that job at home where we would sit and braid this stuff. And then we would bring it down to the couple of hat factories. Yeah. So that's how at least we got employed at home for a little bit anyway. And the third industry, actually, that really was very popular in Holliston, and this was even in the late 19th century, early 20th century, was thanks to the Harwood baseball factory in Natick. And I have one story that came down out of that Harwood would send out a barrel, and you would have, like, say, 100. They would count. 100 baseballs, okay? And you would sit at home and you would sew them together. And then you would send them back. But you know that you had your receipt for 100 balls. Well, what if there were 102? They miscounted? The kids, particularly in Mudville, would keep the extra balls instead of doing homemade balls. So that was a little perk on the side. But a lot of people in Holliston were doing this, no doubt in the whole area. So So that was really good. Now, what was Holliston like? We do have little bits and pieces about what we hear about what Holliston was like. And this is one from John Mason Batchelder, who, born and raised in Holliston, not a townie. But, well, he apparently, the rumor has it, this is brings up the other thing too, that he may have been born in Medway. So, but lest that be heard, yeah. But we'll take him for a townie because he was kind of quintessential for it. I'll grant him that. But he wrote this in one of his essays, and this kind of like gives you an idea about what he saw in Holliston in the mid-19th century. He said, "No railroads, no telegraph, no telephone or automobiles. Travel was by stagecoach, horseback, or go as you please. Liquors were to be obtained at all the hotels and taverns and stores in Holliston. Teaming was largely by ox teams. In 1812 to 1814, Nathaniel Johnson drove an express team from Boston to Philadelphia with 4 oxen in employ of the government, taking about 6 weeks for the trip, but the close of the war ruined that industry." That was in the War of 1812, which was not very popular in New England, by the way. "Washington Street from East Holliston Depot to the Sherburne Willows was not even built. The thoroughfare to Boston, you had to pass along Whitney Street by way of South Sherburne and South Natick until 1829. This also was the route that George Washington took when he came from Sherburne through Holliston. It was not through what we would know as the Sherburne Flats. You know, that only was built in the 1830s, and not much of it either. The old meeting house stood at the corner of Hollis Street, nearly in front of the present town hall building. Farming was the principal industry, the shoemaking business just coming to the front. Money was scarce, barter the principal method of trade, and yet these people were as happy and contented and enjoyed life as well as the overlooked city dwellers in the 20th century." So that's just a little bit of Holliston. So now we go on to, all right, what did people do when they were asked to write something about Holliston? The first book that came out with anything to do with Holliston, this is a good one, was by good old, I don't think he even has a picture of himself. No, he put John Quincy Adams in the front of it. I don't know why he didn't put his own picture in it. But anyway, Abner Morse, in 1856, took on the task of writing what we really kind of say is the first history of Holliston. And the name on the book, is History of Sherburne and Holliston. Now, Holliston apparently was an afterthought. This is, and we will be fair to Abner, though. All right, here's Sherburne, and there's Holliston. He was born in Medway, too. All right. So anyway, the thing is, what's really interesting, though, about this particular book is 1856. The whole idea about printing and writing and getting a book into the hands of the public was very different than it is nowadays. Now, the other thing that was very much of interest to everybody was genealogy at that time. This is when genealogy bloomed. And this is how he approached history. So in order to get pieces out of this book about various people in Holliston, you had to look through by looking at the people. And one of them in here, which really got me, and these are people that he didn't always say if they were in Holliston or Sherburne, so you had to kind of like pick through it. But picking through it can be a heck of a lot of fun. And this one here, let's see, where is she? Yeah, okay, yeah. This is Mary Bullen. She was married to Jabez Stratton. Okay, they lived basically where Sherburne is now. Settled upon the farm left by her father at Chestnut Brook, now Isaac Cozzens. Of course, everybody knew where all these places were back then. Okay, she died February 7th of 1805, but it says she died. She died then. Okay, and she was the last witch in Sherborn. Okay, accused of miraculous power derived from the Satan. Now we're talking the early 19th century with this, but you had to dig through to find this. She unfortunately didn't get more lines than this. But of course, all us historians in Holliston and Sherborn were going, who was she? Where did she live? What? Did you see? Yeah, I know, I can't figure it out. The last witch? You mean there were more? This is wonderful, you know. And you would find just smattering through here. That's how he approached it. Apparently what he would do, he would go around Sherborn and eventually Holliston and just ask people to tell him stories about what they remembered from the past or stories that were told to them. That's how you had to do it in 1856. So he did. And he got a little bit on Holliston. So what did he talk about? The Great Sickness. That was the big story that he came up with. Now the thing is, in Holliston, this was in 1752, 53, there was some sort of an illness that went through the population and killed a very large, significant number of people. And we called it the Great Sickness. It was going on in Sherborn too, but they were a little bit more, I don't know, romantic about it, and they called it the memorable malady versus the Great Sickness. I love that. It's just really great. But he had his work cut out for him to come around and find out what history there was to be had in Holliston. So it was a very difficult task. So we must thank him for the few pages that he did send. Most of them, unfortunately, maybe for some people they might find this interesting, but it would be the list of selectmen, the representatives that came from Holliston that were sent to the Great and General Court, you know, that one that named us Holliston. And one of the ones that I found very interesting was all of the graduates of Harvard that came from Holliston. So it was very important then, you know. So, yeah, but he did put in a little bit about the genealogy with a lot of Holliston people too, but also about mineralogy, the soil composition, and geology. I found that a little more interesting, the lakes and the scenery, and also the cemeteries. So then you get that mindset. Now, but I want to hand this around because I want you to take a look at just, you know, any one of the pages and maybe just slightly run your hand over the page, because this will illustrate to you what it was like to get a book published at this time. Here, Abner would send off his pages all written out with a nib pen. We did not have ballpoint pens. Yeah, we didn't have anything like that. Maybe he used a quill, I don't know, but they did have nib pens. And then he would send it off to the printer, and some poor sucker of a worker in that shop would be doing the typesetting on this. And you look at the typesetting and said, wow, and they got all those dates. I mean, my God, I hope he had good handwriting. And would have to set the book, get it published, and send it out. But rub your hand along on a page and you will see the roughness on the print. Some pages are even more obvious about it. This is from a printing press, not like the books that we see nowadays where if you rub your hand across the print that it's smooth and you feel no change in the depth of it. In this one, you do. So, huh?
What year is that book?
1856. Yeah, so this is right on the cusp of it, because the next thing we're going to see about what was the next historian up against. But yes, in the front here, you got a picture of John Quincy Adams, and a nice little tissue over here. Boston, it was at the printed by Press of Damrell and Moore in Boston, 1856. So you know. Page by page, probably. So here that is. So take a look at that one and marvel at how that was put together. And the poor kid, or is probably just a young guy, would have to do the typesetting for this. Yeah.
You know, when he was collecting the data, would he just be speaking with men at the time?
Collecting the data for the book, would he be speaking with the men? Yes, of course. Of course, he'd be mostly with the men. I could not see anywhere in there where anything even sounded like an interview with a woman. Yeah, because the one about Mary, the witch, was actually just almost like a second thought or a footnote below her husband's things. And I didn't bother to tell you about the husband with his claim to fame for all eternity now, is that he had a giant 30-pound wen on his back when he died. How would you like to be known for that? I would rather be known as a witch. And why didn't she, if she had miraculous powers, how did he end up with this thing on his back, Yeah, right. Good point, Chris. So now the next, the next one that I want to talk about was John Mason Batchelder. Now I didn't bother to bring in anything that was really written about him. He would write essays, and he would present them at the Historical Society meetings, and then he would have them published in the Framingham News, and this would be between 1900 to 1917, because he died in 1917. So that way we have compilations of all of his articles, so they do form a very nice book. Now, what did John talk about? Well, he didn't get into any controversial subjects. He didn't often mention a lot of people by name. For instance, he did write one about the Irish Catholic population of Holliston, but I was really disappointed that he barely mentioned a soul by name, which that kind of bothered me. So I did spend a lot of time trying to dig into the history of Holliston to try to find some of these people, their names and who they were and what they did. Because that's much more interesting to me, about little daily things. Jerry Mahoney, who lived on Mechanic Street, and he had the, as they said back, this is in the 1880s and 90s, he had the worst string of bad luck of anybody in Holliston history. Yeah, so runaway teams, coming down Hollis Street. One child nearly died, got into some poison in the barn, set the barn on fire, burned. It went on and on. Oh, and the best part was that apparently on the railroad tracks, that you could take your wagon up there and it was just set right so that you could go along on a shortcut along using the railroad tracks to get from one point to another. Well, unfortunately, the Exchange Street, that bridge, is not the original one. That was built later after Jerry Mahoney, and his team of horses fell through the ties. And they had to get a bunch of people to get the horse up, off, because it was all open underneath on that bridge going across. So why in heaven's name would they do a thing like that? But this is the sort of thing that, that was of this era. So, but John Mason Batchelder had it a little easier. He still had fountain pens, which, slows you down. But also, the age of the typewriter came in. And he had a typewriter, so he was able to at least get the stuff done and probably make it a lot easier when he would send his work over. Chris, you could probably appreciate that. Can you imagine getting these handwritten things that you'd have to, in a vet, you'd have to typeset it, But he would do that. But he would do it story by story. He would just take all those quintessential subjects that you would see in Holliston. It would be, he did a little bit on the schools, about the old red cabinet that was in the town hall, but things that were really near and dear to him. He was the man who built the house, the big Victorian house up on Jasper Hill, which will be coming down soon. Very sad, but he was the one that had that house. That's what they're, unfortunately, it was treated very badly in its old age. Let's put it that way. It was very sad, very sad. So, unfortunately, it will be coming down. We'll write a story about it. We'll be writing a story. We figured we would wait until it was all the way down to get the total demise on it. So, but it is sad. But that was John Mason Batchelder. He was a young, proper, you could say, born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He was the son of John Batchelder, the shoe manufacturer. His jobs were very light in the way of effort. He ran a little dry goods store for a while. He held several town offices. He was connected with the Holliston Savings Bank as a trustee. He didn't really, to me, he didn't really have to exert himself too much. So, but that was life in that era. Now, the next person who comes along is somebody that you might not have heard about, Daniel Chase. Although he was born in New Jersey, so he wasn't a townie. See, I'm going to make you feel better, okay? Yeah. So, thing is, yes, but he grew up in Holliston. He actually was a library trustee for 20 years or more. And I will make a confession that only recently did I realize that Daniel Chase, his real name was Ernest Chase. Now, I had seen Ernest Chase floating around like in the 20s and in town reports like with the library trustees. I thought it was his brother, but it wasn't. His pen name was Daniel Chase. Now, on his gravestone down on the Cape, it says Daniel Chase. So he kept it long after, but we'll get to how that happened. I do believe he was a bit shy. He had alopecia and was very self-conscious about it. We only have one picture of him. He was on the committee that organized the 1924 bicentennial, but he's the only one missing from the picture. And his name is there. And it was only actually within the last 5 years or so that I found out about this Ernest versus Daniel thing. And it was revealed to me by a librarian archivist in London who sent me a letter to ask me about this, Ernest Chase, blah, blah, and I go, wait a minute, you're asking me about Ernest Chase and you're telling me all about Dan Chase. So, yeah, that was his pen name. They go, I had to wait this long to find out. That's what's so great about doing like local history. You're finding out new things all the time. But what about this Daniel Chase? All right, he was a writer. He wrote 5 novels. He used Holliston in 3 of them as a backdrop, not naming Holliston. He called the Holliston pseudonym was Jalam. Pines of Jalam is this book. All right. He lived on Norfolk Street. He grew up in the house that's right there on the curve where Franklin Street comes out, and there's a big white house that sits right there at the intersection, right up, sort of raised up. He grew up there. He then purchased a house that was down, I think it's like number 152, 146, it's before 146. It's along the straightaway there before Franklin Street on that side. He bought a house there when, after World War II. He got a government job down in Washington during the war. And then when he came back, he finally married. He was like he's about 50 when he got married, so he waited. Married Julia Tenney. That's another story. Anyway, he wrote 5 novels. This one, supposedly, the rumor was that it was up for a National Book Award or a Pulitzer Prize or something like that. No, it didn't make it, but it was like 1931, I think. But it's really neat. When you read these books that he has written, you see Holliston scattered through the pages. And but this is one of his claims to fame. So, now the thing is, you can still pick up these books on used markets, but there's a better way if you really just want to, catch a little bit of the story. If you go into Google Books, at least 2 of his books are in their entirety, and you can read them right online by way of Google's Books. Just go into Google Books and you go Daniel Chase. And you'll see a lot of other Daniel Chases also, but you'll see Pines of Jalam. And there's Flood Tide was his first book. And that one, I was researching that back in the 90s, trying to figure out if he was the Daniel Chase that wrote it, because the Holliston Public Library apparently dumped out all of his books long after he was gone because they were not in the archives. I rectified that situation and bought them and got them to take them back. But flood tide, I happened to be in Washington, D.C. I went down to the Library of Congress. I was there on another thing. But I said, you know what, I'm going to just go in there and see, because I know that they got a copy of the book Flood Tide by Daniel Chase. And so I got the copy. I'm sitting there and everything. They bring it to you and all that. And I started thumbing through it. And I said, do I find Holliston? Can I find Holliston in this? And I turned to a page, and he's talking about Valentine's Rock in Lake Winthrop. Valentine's Rock, and the whole legend about how apparently somebody hid behind the rock during King Philip's War, when the Indians came through and he hid behind that rock. No, that never happened. Apparently, the other legend is that it was named Valentine's Rock. And does anybody know of Valentine's Rock? If you're down at Lake Winthrop, especially at the point, and you look off a little bit to the left, there is a rock that shows, somebody put a stake in it this season so that you could at least see it, probably for the boats. Anyway, it's a large rock. It's towards the north end of the pond, and it's been known as Valentine's Rock. There's one story that man was Valentine that was hiding behind it. But the other story is that sometime around the 1870s, 80s, and around the 19th century, there was a bunch of young kids out on the lake skating, and one kid dared another kid with the last name of Valentine, said, hey, I bet if you can skate up to that rock and then jump over it. And the kid said, oh, and the kid said, I bet you can't do that. Oh, yeah, you can't. You don't think I can do that? Well, I'm going to do that. So he tried and he missed and hit the rock more than the ice. And I do believe he did not die. I will not start a rumor that he did, but after all that time, it has been known as Valentine's Rock. Now, I think that's a more plausible story, really, than the one about, because, for one thing, the Native Americans during King Philip's War did not come marauding through the woods of Holliston, not that we have ever heard that they did. They did walk through Holliston on Pout Lane, over those stones that hopefully will now be revealed in Charles River. Once they get rid of the dam, they would walk across there and follow along. It was a secondary pathway to the Mendon Path. Mendon Path is actually right about where Route 109 is, and Pout Lane follows roughly Route 16. Meanders through the woods. We have Wenakeening Woods, and Wenakeening, that's another whole story. Okay, yeah, won't go there. But anyway, I digress. But anyway, if you want to read a couple of his books, look up Daniel Chase, and Hardy Rye, I think, is the other one. There's a book called Backfire. It's his way, I think he was writing a mystery on that one, and then Middle Passage, which is historical fiction on sailing ships and everything. But Hardy Rye, Flood Tide, and Pines of Jalam, he uses the backdrop of Holliston, including culling historical names, Lavinia, for instance, and several other names as characters for the books. So that lives on. But not only did he do that, but there's another story about Dan Chase in history. We have in the archives of the Historical Society all of his manuscripts. None of his historical research about Holliston has ever been published. It's sitting there in the files, just waiting to be discovered by historians. And he had this letter that he sent to the Holliston Public Library. He says, look, because somebody had asked, about whether or not he ought to publish them. He says, well, it's 90,000 words in the books the manuscripts that he pulled out. I don't know. The library kind of said, I don't know if we're interested in doing it. So there they stay in the files, all typewritten in notebooks, all with bits of history of Holliston. But one of the best notebooks was his handwritten notebook. And this is what I want you to hear about, because this is what we want to kind of recreate in some way. with the new idea about writing a history of Holliston, we're going to take a few hints from what Dan Jace did back in the 1930s, mostly. So he went around, walking around Holliston, talking to people, gathering up little vignettes and little stories, kind of like what Abner was doing back in the 1850s. Okay. Henry Dickinson told me that the Watch House, formerly standing on Prospect Street near John Carey's, was a hip-roofed, one-story house burned when occupied by a Billy Briggs. Oh, let me tell you, I followed Billy Briggs in the newspapers. Interesting character. Okay. A raw-boned Prince Edward Islander who later died, oh, yeah, not a townie, who later died in a shack off Mellon Street and was eaten, this is a good one, eaten by rats, oh, before he was found through the clamor raised by his dog, who was tied outside and starving. He went around town gathering all these stories like that. Now, we won't put in the stories now. I think we're a little more sophisticated. But this is what he would do. That the French roof on the house at the northeast corner of Winter and Washington Street, which still has the new Empire French-style roof on that house, okay, was built on by Nathaniel Johnson. His house was formerly had a pitched roof. New Empire-style roofs went on many of the houses around Holliston. There's still a few of them left, especially that one. That was all to modernize and make the houses look more, modern.
Isn't that also the roof? There's a house on the corner of Underwood and Washington Street.
Yes.
And that, it always amazed me. There are two
Yeah.
houses. One was built in 1810
Oh,
and
oh,
one was built in
yes.
1813. But the one that was built in 1810 has the mansard roof.
yes.
The other one is clearly
Yes, the hip-style roofs in Holliston, right. Now, there's two stories that you have now brought up that I must digress a little on. First of all, yes, a lot of people went around doing hip roofs. Matter of fact, the town hall roof was slightly changed. Instead of the peaks on the side, they had wheelhouse round ones. Apparently, they didn't like them. There's one silly rumor, but the other one, it was probably because they leaked or they weren't well built. But anyway, the thing was that many of them in the 1920s and 30s decided that they didn't like those new Empire French roofs anymore, and they reverted most of them. But apparently, who lived in the house at the corner of Winter, Washington, did not have the money to do the reversion, and that's what happened. Now, one little aside about circus signs in Holliston. You've heard it here, all right? Most of them are wrong.
that's another thing I wonder about.
Yes, most of them are wrong. Yeah, especially, for example, a couple of houses in Mudville, which have 1800 on them, and I chided one of the owners and said, 1800? There's nothing here in 1800. There wasn't even the rail trail. Yeah, there's nothing here in 1800. Yes, most of them are wrong. I've done almost a, in industry, people will call me and I just bought a new house in Holliston, and the plaque says that it's a, blah, 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 and it says, but I heard from the realtor that the house was built in 1810, whatever, and I said, no, it wasn't. And some of them take it well and some don't. Yeah, and apparently we're trying to figure out the theory as to why this is happening. It comes from a spreadsheet that was put out, I believe, by I think it's the town. I'm not sure if it was. I don't want to put I don't want to put the crime at the feet of the wrong people. But anyway, in it shows, if you look at it, if you put in just the date for anything from like 1800 back, okay, in the 1700s, it will show all the houses, there. Well, most of them, no. They got houses that were built like in, maybe 1845 if they're lucky, and it says 1736, and that's one on Green Street. We think what is happening is that, for instance, the two houses in Mudville that say 1800, that the deeds on the land if you did a deed search, go all the way back to the original owner that first purchased the land. And that land may have been owned by somebody who actually lived up on on today's Washington Street. And then, of course, it was broken down into house lots, because if you look at an 1850 map of what you would want to see in Mudville, there's some streets that are kind of drawn out, but there were no houses. There was a tiny little string of houses on a little bit of Mechanic Street, but not much. But nothing else beyond it. They were planning on, I mean, there was work, because there was like Francis Cutler, for instance, who did build a lot of them in Mudville, and he was purchasing up the land, that land being right up against the railroad and all that. It wasn't agrarian land anymore. Industry was coming in, and we think that the deeds go back to that. Yeah,
Makes sense.
yeah, it does. So, and the thing is, I have to smile at a lot of them, because a lot of them are wrong. What I tell the people, what you have to do is you make a nice little trip into the land court in Cambridge, and you sit down and you go back and back until you find only land and not buildings thereon. And even that's only an estimate. There was no such thing as building permits in Holliston. That is a 20th century item. 20th century building permits came out. So that's on that one. Now, last of all is Dorothy Reese's book from 1924. 74, which was the 50 years after the 1924 book. And I had the great privilege of being able to talk to her about this when I was doing research in Holliston in the 90s. And think of the challenges back in 1974 writing a book. She wrote this book on a portable manual typewriter. She had the typewriter, at least. And she would send off the pages and everything, and she would go to the printer, and they would work out the editing and everything to get it in here. She was limited by the committee to only 100 pages. That's it. She said to me, 100 pages? What can I say in 100 pages? Talk about compaction. And so she said, I just had to, take a few subjects and hope for the best. And she did do the best that anybody could have under the circumstances. She did talk about the great sickness. She did pull out the stories as she could and then put in a few. And how did the book get subsidized? Well, this much was advertising. Nowadays, looking at the advertising can be kind of fun, looking at the companies that were there in 1974. This is really good. Walters, for instance, Framingham Trust, Central Garage, all that. All that stuff, yes, a bit of it's here and a lot of it's gone. So when I talked to her about when I was looking at history, she said her big regret was she wanted to get more into the common people. She didn't want to talk about the selectmen and all the usual suspects that you would talk about in history. She wanted to get down and talk like what Dan Chase did, walking around town talking about what's in Holliston. That's what we did this summer at the farmers market. Set up a table with a few little items on there to try to grab people to come in and to talk about what they think about Holliston. What was it that struck you as being important about Holliston? Give me a little vignette about something that happened in Holliston. For instance, one woman said, well, she moved in 1974, and it was right around St. Patrick's Day, and all the neighbors around her invited her over to a party on St. Patrick's Day as a welcome into the neighborhood. Now, there's a story there. Yeah. Now, as you know, and as you see on your chairs, is that little flyer, and we want to do the same thing. We're not going to have somebody go out there, much as Dorothy Reese had said, of just trying to pull together a few stories and throw them into the book. It's much easier nowadays than what she was up against. Much easier to put a book together, be it Blurb or all of these print-on-demand companies that are right down the street from us. There are many, many ways to do it, and many people who can do it that way. Bobby Blair has done it with 2 books over the past couple of years. And he's got little vignettes and little stories that he would put in there. What we want is for the 300th, is we're asking people to write little vignettes. Do what Dan Chase did. You know, coming through all these little stories that you have. All right, you don't have to write about Billy Briggs being eaten by rats, but I thought that was kind of absurd because I had found other stories in the history in the town about who Billy Briggs was. He was quite an interesting character. Apparently, his main job was he cut wood, went around with an axe and cut firewood. Okay, and apparently he cut off half his foot because he wasn't very good with the axe. But anyway, you know. So. Yeah, but he went around, and a lot of times on these, and this is really great, he would say, if I can find one, he would say, so-and-so told me blah, 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 and then in parentheses down below, not likely. It's just great. And these are just all his little notes that he didn't put into many of his large manuscripts and everything. But, you know, he was very big on the houses. For some reason, people in Holliston really get attached to their houses. Don't expect anybody to have to write out long. I did get one recently, and he said, oh, okay, I wrote that story you wanted. I hit right on the 1,500 words, all right? And I said, that's fine. That is great, because we need the 1,500 word stories, but we also need the 50 word stories. Anybody who has noticed, like, New York Times on Sunday has a section in the first few pages, and it's like, something, 50 words or less. Yeah. And the stories are rich. That's all we're asking, just little vignettes. So what we want is for you to think about even writing up a little vignette. Now, I'm hoping that the Senior Center will do that. I heard about your bulletin board and about how there's little bits and pieces that are up on that. If you string them all together, stories from the Senior Center. We're working on one like that, stories from Mudville. The Orchards. The Orchards has done one. I got in on an email run with them, and just from the emails from one person to the next, to the next, to the next, absolutely fabulous stuff about growing up in the Orchards. And the thing is, everybody's got a little story that you can add to it, be it about the Senior Center or the neighborhood you live in, or maybe you moved to Holliston when you got married, and there's a little story that you can tell. Got a great story from a young man that grew up in the Queens, and the story is fabulous, about his family moving to Westfield Drive. Just unbelievable stuff, and I wish more people down in that neck of the woods maybe would write something up too. But we are even thinking of doing a rudimentary scanning. Now this might be a neat project that we could do. To get them all in there so that once we get them into a file that other people can read them. Because there's a lot of deep history. Case in point, going through all these, there's probably about 300 pages, double space type. Now, one of my dilemmas was why it's called Lake Winthrop, but supposedly the Indian name was Winnickening. I was looking everywhere to try to find the origin of that. I was beginning to think that it was a romanticization of the Indian language in the late 1800s, and maybe that's why somebody made it up and put it on there, because I was just giving up. Until just a little while ago, I'm thumbing through all of Dan Chase's files, and there I found that it was mentioned on a deed, on a Sherburne deed, not a Holliston deed. It was 1669, and it was only attached in this deed to the brook that runs out of Lake Winthrop. There's the story. On one of the flyers there, Richard Gervin wrote up a marvelous, very short, one-page paragraph on what it was like to be a paperboy in the 1960s. Yeah, that's the stuff we're looking for. We already have artwork. We have a man living in Holliston who, I was totally surprised when he walked up to me at the farmer's market. He says, yeah, I write poetry. And I looked at him and I said, can you also do like maybe carpenter or plumbing on my house? Because he had that look,
Yeah.
And I said, oh, how good. Well, he submitted his poetry and I landed on the floor. The stuff is fabulous. He is a new poet laureate of Holliston as far as I'm concerned. Fabulous stuff. One poem he wrote about the cemetery that's up by Hopping Brook. He also wrote another short one for on the cemetery on Cedar Street. And beautiful stuff. And then, various other scenes around town too. They will be in there. Fabulous, fabulous stuff. Thank you.